So first of all, thank you everybody for attending this session and getting in here early. My name is Jean Smith. I'm going to be chairing the session, and the session is called Israel Anti-Semitism Today. There is another session tomorrow, which is Israel at War. This session was actually put on at the last minute, hence the small room, in response to recent events. There's also going to be an online continuation of this discussion on November the 2nd, and you can all get flyers about that. I want to, this is obviously part of the Letters on Liberty strand, and I want to thank GB News, who are sponsoring both this session and the conference. So, first things first, I'm sure everybody is very aware of the events of October the 7th, when Hamas Islamist terrorists moved into Israel and committed the murder of 1,400 civilians, most of whom were Jews. And at the latest count, there are 229 hostages, and that's after the recent release of 4 hostages. And Hamas was very clear, both before and during and after the attack, that its intention was to kill as many Jews as possible. And to show that it was fulfilling its mission, it posted during the pogrom, it posted videos and photos on social media and continued to do that. So the reason why we decided to schedule this kind of at the last minute, if you like, is we want to discuss the response in both the UK and particularly in the Western world. So I'm sure many of you are very aware that within hours of the pogrom, people were celebrating on the streets of London. And it wasn't just in London. It was across the Western world, in Europe, in the United States, in addition to celebrations throughout the Middle East. And what we want to understand in this session is exactly what's going on and what's new about what's going on. You'll all be very aware that there have been anti-Semitic protests. I'm not saying everybody on the demonstrations that say Free Palestine is an anti-Semit, but there have been anti-Semitic protests on the streets of London and elsewhere, as well as a growth of anti-Semitic statements online. And that's before we start talking about the so-called cultural elites who have spoken at length on this issue. So that's just to set the scene. In the discussion, I'm going to try and be as fair as possible. As you can tell, I have strong opinions on this, as do most people, I think. I've been surprised by how many friends of mine have texted me on this topic, outraged at what's been going on. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll be speaking. They'll each speak for 6 minutes. I understand Charlie will speak for less because he's used to condensing 24 hours of events in 60 seconds for his broadcast. And then after that, we've got an hour for discussion. And as you know, the Battle of Ideas stands for free speech. That does not mean denying the right of people that you disagree with to speak. So I ask you not to heckle, not to interrupt the speakers, whether or not they're on the platform or in the audience, because the only way we can really start to understand what's going on, because everything's changing so quickly, is if we can, talk and clarify. And I do want to encourage people that don't really understand what's going on, or they disagree strongly with what one of the speakers has said, to to feel that they can say that. So first off, hot from the Frontline, we have Charlie Peters, who is a reporter and presenter for GB News, recently back from Tel Aviv. Second to speak, we'll have Daniel Ben-Ami, who's a journalist, a creator of the website Radicalism of Fools, the New Anti-Semitism. Then thirdly, we have Josh Howie, who's a comedian, writer, and actor. And I'm sure many of you have seen him on the headlines on GB News at 11 o'clock every evening, repeated again at 5 o'clock in the morning for those that get up early, which I don't. So I don't need to think I'm giving Josh favoritism, but, I just thought I'd mention it. And then last but not least, we'll have Frank Furedi, who's a sociologist and social commentator and executive director of MCC Brussels. So if you could all just give the speakers a round of applause. And I know the speakers are not sensitive, but there's no need to clap after everybody's spoken because it will take up too much time. And I don't want anybody to be offended on the panel, not at this stage anyway. So we're going to start with Charlie, hot from Tel Aviv.
Take this one.
Oh, yes, good idea.
Okay, hello. Yes, I returned on Sunday night, and I got there on day 3. I think we're now on day 22 of the war. On day 5, I met with Mirit Regev. She's an Israeli woman. She doesn't speak any English, but she had an interpreter with her, and both of her children had been taken hostage on the 7th from the Supernova Festival. You'll recall that Hamas struck this target in the early hours of the beginning of their attacks on southern Israel. Much of the GB News broadcast from Tel Aviv was just an update on the hour, every hour of the latest news lines, and it was difficult for us to find time to meet voices and people who had actually experience of what had happened. But when we did, in those early days, it was mostly with people who had seen awful and appalling things. Mirit was very much one of them. She noticed that her son was taken when she saw a video still uploaded by Hamas of his hand. She recognized his hand based on the structure of it in his veins. And she's since been confirmed that he was taken. And she spoke with enormous clarity and bravery and composure when we met her and interviewed her. I spoke for about half an hour with a Hebrew translator. And it made me think that, if such an event had happened in Britain, I think the composure of the experience of that suffering would not have been the same. And I've kept in touch with Mirit and her family since. And every day we've checked any news because the Israelis don't give much information away. It's families and people on the ground who actually give you the latest on what's going on. The only time that Mirit expressed visible panic was when I had to do the horrible thing in journalism, which is asking a sad question, which is, how do you feel after seeing this footage of your son's face being pulled down from a poster in Edgware Road? How do you feel about seeing this footage of your daughter's face being defaced nearby? It was quite an embarrassing question to ask because this is my country. This is what I am reporting back to Britain. And it was the first time that I saw her lose that quite remarkable composure. And that family, the Regevs, they've come to Britain twice a year, every year for the last 10 years. I don't think they will again once this war is done because they are witnessing something extremely dangerous and scary happening here. And that experience, that sensation, that expression has been reflected across many other Israelis, Arab, Jewish or otherwise, that I've met there who have experience of England and want to come back. I met a lot of British Israelis who said they felt safer in Tel Aviv than they would do in London. They were glad to be in a war zone rather than in Britain right now. And that might sound ludicrous because Tel Aviv was under rocket fire, sometimes 5 times a day, But, there's an Iron Dome missile defense system to intercept these rockets at a cost of $100,000 per rocket. Thank you to the American taxpayer for keeping us away from such appalling experiences. But there's no Iron Dome or Patriot missile defense system for what's going on in Britain, for some of the demonstrations that Jean's referred to and some of the things that you undoubtedly would have seen. There's no Patriot defense system for the posters of hostages being pulled down and defaced. There's no defense system for people calling for jihad in Trafalgar Square, not being arrested, and then the Met saying, well, actually, there are different interpretations of the term jihad, and there are alternative ways of referring to the mujahideen. I know some lovely people in mujahideen. They see that and they think, yeah, no thanks. Since I've gone back, I've been covering, I think actually a more interesting story, which is how the war is affecting Britain and how it's going on here. And that has meant reviewing lots of footage from mosques on Friday prayers. There have been 3 Friday prayers now across the country. And it's all online. It's all readily available. Not many people are watching these clips, but the GB News Investigates team is, and several days have been poured into them. We'll release a full dossier on Monday, about 4,000 words, 20 plus clips taken from. But last night we broadcast a few snippets, and I'm going to read. I apologise for reading, but many of these preachers are as litigious as they are loony. At a South Wales mosque, one speaker referred to the criminal Jews who need to be acted on. And there's an escalation when the criminal Jews act. This mosque is a registered charity. It's received taxpayers' funding. A mosque in Yorkshire said, may Allah grant victory to the Muslims and to the Muslims of the Al-Quds especially. Now, if I was being like a Met officer, I could say that, the Al-Quds brigades could refer to anyone. It could, refer to some nefarious group, but it's likely that it refers to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And by the way, why would you call a terrorist organization Islamic Jihad? It's like naming a startup technology company. It's a bit on the nose. A London mosque said, Muslim armies must invade for izzat, an Arab term for honor. And another mosque in Leeds, an imam said of Hamas, don't criticize them. Don't blame them. If you can't help the situation, shut up, just be quiet. That is a small flavor of what we are intending to release on Monday night. There is a lot more where that came from. And the more footage like this that I watch, the more I start to understand why on day 3, plenty of Britons and Israelis told me they're safer in Tel Aviv than they are in London. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the microphone now, just so I'm ready. Okay, Daniel.
Okay, well, I did have a speech prepared, but I ripped it up last night. I was going to talk about why I don't like this idea of anti-Semitism as the oldest hatred, because I think that's a bit misleading, but I'm going to put that on my website. And instead, what I want to talk about is Islamism as a form of politics. And the word politics should be in your brain. That's the kind of key point I'm trying to get across. And it actually follows on. I didn't know this beforehand, but it follows on from what Charlie said in an important respect. And the reason I ripped my speech up, 2 reasons really. One, I read a report by Professor Matthew Goodwin, who I think was in this conference. I don't think he's in this room. But he looked at a survey of public opinion in America, and he found that if you take the 18 to 24-year-old age cohort in America, and you ask them, do you prefer Hamas or do you prefer Israel? So not the Palestinians, but Hamas specifically, or Israel. 48% said they would prefer Hamas, an Islamist military terrorist organization. Now, I don't think that all 48 out of 100 will get into paraglides and mow down Jews in Crown Heights or somewhere in New York, but I think it does show an incredible, at a minimum, an incredible amount of confusion that 48% of people in that age group in America would say that they would prefer Hamas to Israel. It just becomes unbelievable and shows we have a very, very serious problem. Also, in kind of parallel to that, I've heard people on the pro-Israeli side not say anything remotely comparable, but I think there's a lot of confusion about Islamism and what it represents. I don't think that the vast majority of the people on the pro-Israeli side hate Muslims. On the contrary, they're kind of falling over themselves to say they don't hate Muslims. But there is a lot of confusion about, how do we understand this phenomenon? How do we understand what Islamism is? And this very neatly follows on from what Charlie said, I think, because he spelt out the facts, which I have no doubt that are accurate. He's a very scrupulous journalist, and no doubt about the accuracy. But that still leaves open the question of how do you interpret all of this kind of hate preaching in Britain? You could just say, well, Charlie's an Islamophobe, and he's made it all up. Which I think is, complete nonsense, but evidently people have already said that. So it's not a hypothetical accusation. People have already accused him of being an Islamophobe. And of course, Josh isn't completely innocent because he also works for GB News, so guilty by association of being an Islamophobe. But as far as I'm concerned, this accusation of Islamophobia is just a kind of slur. It's just a way to try and silence debate. You could draw the conclusion that all Muslims are like this. All the 2 billion or so Muslims in the world are kind of horrible and bigoted, and that's what they like. And a few people do that, but I think it's a very small number. I think the most common conclusion is that this is an extremist form of Islam. So you have moderate, respectable Islam, and you have the extremists, and we have to deal with the extremists. I suspect probably most people in this room hold that view, I can't be sure. I also think that's wrong. And I haven't got time to really substantiate my argument, but just to state it broadly, I would argue that Islamism is a political movement in a religious guise, a political movement in a religious form. That's the key thing, I think, to understand about it. So it's a political movement that obviously has a lot of significant traction, not a majority by any means, but significant traction within the Islamic community. But it's a particular kind of political movement which is anti-democratic, anti-modern, completely kind of reactionary political movement. And although it uses Islamic language, is very, very influenced by European thought. And obviously not the best element of European thought, but on the contrary, the most backward, terrible forms of racial thinking, for example, in Europe. So Islamism as a political movement really emerged in a big way in Egypt in the early 20th century with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a key organization founded in 1928. And a lot of these other Islamist organizations, including Hamas, including ISIS, kind of spin-offs from the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you want to understand Islamism, in fact, what I really, really recommend people do, and this is serious, it's not at all meant lightly, people should really, really read the Hamas Charter. You can Google it. It's available in English, translated by the Avalon Project of Yale University. You read the Hamas Charter, certainly uses Islamic language, but it also says things like, the Jews were responsible for the First World War and the Second World War, which I can guarantee you is not in the Quran and is not in the Hadith, the kind of sayings of the Prophet, directly taken from European racist thought, taken from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was an anti-Semitic Tsarist forgery. So really, just to conclude, we really need to have a serious discussion about Islamism and what it represents, but I would argue very strongly it's a political phenomenon, despite the fact that it appears to be primarily a religious one.
Thank you. Josh, over to you.
Okay, thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. So I just wanted to quickly give you my perspective, because I think, unlike these people, they are clever and written books and do things like that. I've written my notes here, and on the other side are some knob gags that I'll be performing this evening as a comic. So, which, by the way, people have been emailing the venues to try and get cancelled, and of not being able to actually say why, of course, what have I said wrong. But anyway, but that's maybe we'll talk about that later. So what is my perspective? I am a left-wing Jew. I was raised in a very left-wing family. My parents worked with Labour Party doing their PR. It was the default position. Tories are bad. Brexit's bad, boo. Whatever. And also, then I became a comic. I worked in the comedy industry, which is obviously an incredibly left-wing industry as well. I wasn't actually raised as a Jew. I became more religious as I got older. But I think the first point I want to make is that what we're talking about here is not weirdly sort of somewhat counter to, I think, what you're saying, even though I do agree with the point. But it isn't political in the way that we understand it here. It's not about left or right. And that is my first understanding of what's gone on, and certainly from the 7th of the 10th. I got involved politically, and I'm not really a political comic, because when Corbyn got elected, I started seeing people from my own side posting things, and I try and argue with it, and then I'd see friends of mine or associates defend it, and there's this feeling of being gaslit, and I was gradually brought into a community of about 200 Jewish people and a few allies fighting Corbynism online, mainly through Twitter and then Facebook and whatnot. And this brings me to my second point, where this stuff is complicated, whether it's the history of Israel, whether it's anti-Semitism, it's complicated. And why is that important to really understand is because the left are lazy. That's what I believe. The left, fundamentally, part of the identity of being left-wing is that you are on the right side of history, you are a good human being, and thus you don't need to read anything else. That's it. You've done your job. You've done your hard work. And that's the problem. And I think that's what we need to break through in order to actually try and solve this issue, which is part of the reason we're here and hopefully towards discussing it. And also because you learn other things. And the moment you sort of go, wait a minute, just being left-wing isn't enough to be in the right, you start looking at other stuff. Well, if they got this, the Guardian, my beloved Guardian, got this stuff wrong about Corbyn, what else have they got wrong? Oh, what's this stuff they're writing about trans ideology? What's the stuff they're writing about the responses to COVID? You know, once your eyes get open to this stuff, obviously you don't get closed again. This isn't like about being red pill or whatever. But the point is, it isn't just like we have to listen to our one or two primary sources of moral superiority and then just feel good about ourselves. I learned a few lessons fighting Corbynites and then fighting trans ideologues online. One is that reason isn't going to work. Two is politeness doesn't work. But it is important to fight because it's about the silent majority. That is who ultimately you're trying to win over. And when you respond to people on threads and whatever, by not couching your language within politeness and like, oh, I know that I'm not really a Zionist, by standing up and taking a stand and going, no, I am a Zionist, what's your problem? By being more aggressive with it, it then puts people on the back foot and you're not a victim anymore. And just quickly before what happened, like 2 years ago, where Hamas sent over rockets, Israel then sent missiles back, and then there were big protests in the street. And Jews stood up, saw what we've seen now, but no one actually else really stood with Jews. So that brings us to 7th of 10th, because I think it is a fundamental shift here, because the amount of people who died, the barbarity with which they were murdered, gave the fog cleared. And for a moment, everybody, Jew and non-Jew, saw the reality of the situation. Now, what then happened is Islamists and the far left did the best that they could to get that fog machine working again to cover it all up. And that's what they've been doing furiously for the last 3 weeks. But the silent majority, the most important people in this country and in the world, in the West, saw very clearly what we are dealing with. So who is the enemy? And I'm sorry to refer to it like that, but I believe this is a fight, and this is a fight ultimately for our civilization, for a liberal democracy where people can behave and do what they want to do as long as it doesn't affect other people. The enemy is Islamists, as we were talking about, probably political Islam, and the far left. Why the far left as well? Because they are providing the Islamists with the protection. If it was just a bunch of people out there shouting jihad on the street, they probably would have been arrested by now, but they're not. They've offered the shield of legitimacy by the far left. And that is, for me, what I see personally as the solution to dealing with this is about confronting the far left and taking away that shield, confronting the far left within our institutions, within the police, the media, at universities, celebrities. We have Stormzy yesterday putting out a ridiculous post. He's got 3 million followers and he's not being properly challenged on that stuff. It's not, we've got the charity sector, the civil service, the unions. This stuff has to be exposed. I'm not talking about cancellations. I'm talking just about exposure and moving on from there. But for me, that is where the solution can be found to dealing with this.
Thank you, Josh. Okay, last but not least, Frank.
Right, thank you very much. Now, what I've learned since October the 7th is, number one, the slogan "Never Again" is got no content to it, and it doesn't mean anything anymore. Number two, Holocaust education turned out to be a joke, and all that money spent on Holocaust teaching and everything else turned out to be a performative ritual that never grabbed the imagination of most people. And number three, a significant section of Western society, particularly in the cultural domain, and not just the left, but in the cultural domain, do not really like Jewish people very much. Now, it doesn't mean to say that they are going to go out and put on a brown shirt, but they think that Jewish people are morally inferior to the rest of society. That's the three things that I've learned. Now, why is that? Well, I think that in a sense, what we've seen and what's new and interesting and horrific about the present-day situation is that actually people don't see the same scenes. So when you said everybody saw what happened on that day, that's partially true. I mean, visually and physically, people saw the same thing. But some people were so desensitized from understanding the horrific dimension of what was taking place that for them it was akin to like a video game. It was a spectacle which they could either respond relatively neutrally to or even celebrate. And I think that is very new, a new development that Hamas felt that unlike in previous era, when you committed an atrocity, even the Nazis would hide the concentration camp so people wouldn't know about it. They actually flaunted it so that people could see in front of their eyes exactly what they were doing. It's very new and it's very interesting that occurred. Even more horrific is the fact that for some people, that reaction that they had was was one that I was shocked by. Because basically what it told me was they had a very dehumanized conception of what a Jew is like. So the dehumanization of Jewish people, which the Nazis only achieved minimally, I think has been sort of achieved in a much more sophisticated way in the 21st century without using any of that language. Now, why is this happening? I think the first thing that's important is the anti-Semitism of Islamism, which is the one I care the least about. Because the reason why Islamism is inherently anti-Semitic is because in the Middle East, the only way that after the failure of Arab nationalism, the only way that there could be any semblance of coherence to Islamism was by hatred towards Israel. That was the one thing that bound all of them together. They had a lot of divisions, but the one thing that brought all the sects together was that they hated Israel. And to make the little jump, the conceptual leap from hating Israel to hating Jews, not really very difficult. You don't need to have a PhD in public relations to make that kind of shift. So I can really understand the Islamist hatred of Jews, which kind of originates from the fact that this has become a key source of legitimacy. And why almost spontaneously a significant section of Islamic society, will never forgive Jews about anything and will do their best to sort of either neutralize it or pathologize whatever Jews and not just Israelis are doing. Now, the second point that comes out of this is that because of migration, because of the impact of Islamic societies on Europe and elsewhere, Islamism has given old school anti-Semites permission to be openly anti-Jewish. And that's the role that Islamism has done. They've given people permission to regard Jews as kind of a lower form of human beings. So people who until recently would have been scared or reluctant to express their views about the Rothschilds of this world, the bankers and everything else, felt much more empowered to basically say this. And the third thing that is linked to this is, and this is the big enemy as far as I'm concerned, the one we have to really fight, is identity politics. And identity politics isn't just the far left, because identity politics has seeped into all of the cultural institutions of our society. It's in schools every single day. One of the reasons why young people in America and elsewhere take the position they do is because that's what they've learned from schools. They've learned about the hierarchy of identities. They learned about white privilege. And again, it doesn't require a good public relations person to make the conceptual leap from white privilege to the fact that Jews personify this privilege more than anybody else. So Jews have this unfortunate role of being the hyper-white section of society. They are more white than white. And as long as they're more white than white, they symbolize, in the eyes of a lot of people, both the key elements of identity politics, but the real hostility that all these identity groups have towards the West. So we have to understand, and this is a really important point, especially if we want to build alliances, that anti-Semitism in its contemporary form is not about just hating Jews, it's actually about hating the West and the Western civilization and the Western way of life. And it's really something that we really got to explain to people, because if you imagine for 1 second that this hatred is going to stop with a few, after you got rid of the Jews, you're wrong, because the next day or the day after that, it's going to be the rest of the Western world that's going to be targeted. So what we're dealing with is a very new phenomenon, and I think our job is to take on identity politics in the European kind of context and do it boldly. People say it's a complex issue. It's not a complex issue. What is the only that's complex in this whole issue is the confusion of people. But the issues at stake are very stark. They're black and white, and we need to be non-defensive. Right? We got to declare what we stand for. We cannot give in. We cannot censor ourselves. And unless we are prepared to have a little bit of courage and fight back against this massive anti-Jewish kind of flow that's kind of flooding all over Europe, unless we're prepared to do that, then we're going to suffer a very, very big defeat that's going to have very long-term civilizational consequences. And I'm not using the word civilization lightly.
Okay, everybody keep clapping. Okay, so I have some questions, but I'm sure they'll be answered in the conversation we're about to have. So I'm going to take a round of questions, and if you could remember to try and be as concise as possible, which is something I never am, then it's something to aspire to. So I'm going to take them, and I'm going to describe you by your clothing, because it's a controversial thing, describing people. So I'm going to take the man in the green T-shirt, and then I can see a hand right at the back, but I can't see who it is.
I wanted to ask Charlie a question. Charlie, isn't it? I was interested in the story that you're going to talk about on Monday, you said, about the mosques. I don't know how many mosques that you investigated in terms of, I don't know how many mosques are in the country. I don't know what percentage of mosques are going to be the ones that you talk about. What I worry about is that we are in a very difficult time at the moment. In anti-Semitic attacks have gone up in London, I heard on the radio, and equally Islamophobic attacks have gone up as well, because you get both sides of extremes, don't you? So what I worry about is media organisations, maybe like yourselves or maybe others, stoke that. I think there's an important thing to do in terms of reporting what's going on. I'm not denying that. If there are clerics that are stoking up and being anti-Semitic in his mosques, and we know there are, obviously, from looking at terrorism cases, there have been radical clerics that have stoked up young men to go and bomb places like London. So we know that that's a fact, from some of the cases that have been had. But I worry about your sort of organisation. If you're going to do that, if you're going to do it, put it in the context of what percentage, because otherwise...
Don't worry, I will.
So good. Because otherwise, people like me...
Stop interrupting him.
People like me who've got brown skin, who live in parts of the country where there are very few people like me, are likely to be attacked by people on the right, who are idiots. They're thugs.
Okay,
So I worry
I need you to wind up.
So my point is I worry about stoking up Islamophobia just on the basis there's a very small percentage of idiots and bad people in these mosques.
Okay, that's great. Now we're going. I can see Guy. I'm going to take Guy, and then I'm going to take the man in front of him with the glasses on his head.
Maybe with the microphone at the back.
I think the basic thing is with Israel and democracies, they want to know the truth. But with the Muslim, the Islamic ideology, it's honour, you see. And so, there's a difference. They'll use all sorts of propaganda because of honour. They don't want to be defeated. That's what matters much more than truth. And, Israel, has They were chosen even biblically to be a light to the world. And I mean, medically, scientifically, in many ways, they have been amazing what they've given to the world, you know, and done for the world. And I mean, 5 wars before this, 6 now, and everyone has not been started by them. And they gain the victory. They can't be eradicated. They're still with us. And I believe Israel will never be uprooted. So I believe what's left in the hands of Israel now is, from the West, to eradicate Hamas. As the West eradicated ISIS, it is now left to Israel to do the work. And somehow or other, and they have an ethical army, but it's not easy. Somehow or other, I think they should be allowed to, in the best way, and we do love the people of Palestine, but in the best way, to eradicate this terrible people.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to take Guy now. Guy's going to show us an example of being concise.
Do any of the panel have any information on the syllabus that was introduced, I think it was in 2021, on the history of the founding of establishment of Israel in 1948, and whether that is accurate and fair or not?
Okay, that's great. I'm going to take... Yeah. I'm going to take the man with the glasses on his head, and then I'm going to take Lily next to him.
Well, understandably, a lot of it's focusing on Israel, and even the last curriculum question does. But actually, there's a British, I think, History Society text called Teaching Challenging Subjects in the Curriculum that advises teachers on how to skirt around the Holocaust and the Crusades. The problem, as I see it, and I think Frank raised it, is this is a mainstream problem. You know, it's extremism doesn't come out of the blue. It doesn't land out, you know, from space. It is an extreme expression of mainstream confusions. The mainstream has allowed itself to be nervous about freedom of expression, and there's a whole generation of people, you know, young, idealistic people who are looking for things to believe in and belong to, who have been let down by the mainstream. They now view ambition as arrogant. They view courage as a problem, development as bad. They are indeed anti-civilization, as Frank has suggested. So the point is, we mustn't discuss it here in terms of extremists, Islamists, and the far left. It is the mainstream. It is right in our midst, in our schools. That is the confusion that needs to be addressed. There's a separate battle going on in Israel.
Okay, keep putting your hands up. I can see people that I know, and I've seen you all, so you can put your hands down now. Thank you. I'm going to take Lily, and then the man that I'm looking right at now. Yeah.
So just 2 quick points. I mean, what do we do about Muslim identity politics? Because we've heard from, I think, Daniel, he said about there's this kind of anti-modern, anti-civilizational politics that runs through the heart of Islamism. But at the same time, we know that many of the people that have been ripping down posters of the hostages have been ostensibly integrated, young, well-educated, upper middle class Muslim women and men. And I think there is a form of identity politics that gets cultivated within the West that seems to be very attractive to some sections of young Muslims, irrespective of whether or not they're integrated or not. So I think there's something different than just the problem of Islamist jihadism. There's something that's attractive to young Western Muslims. And the second question is the broader point about free speech, because this is something, and I spoke about it on the Spike podcast, that I'm quite conflicted on at the moment. There is an anti-Semitic strain that runs through the heart of many of these protests, and we've seen some of the most horrific phrases and imagery being brandished by some of these people. Is it simply a question of this is free speech, when there seems to be, it needs to be balanced against the fact that there is a kind of intimidation and atmosphere being created where visible expressions of Jewishness is very difficult when you could literally be targeted and so on and so forth. So is it so neatly, we need to defend their free speech when actually there's a kind of hostile atmosphere that's being created that's deeply censorious and intimidating?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the man behind you, and then I'm going to come back to the panel and then we'll come back out again. We've got lots of time, so don't be thinking about things.
Yeah. Hello, I'm from Germany, and in Germany on the left, there's a very huge anti-fascist tradition. It's a big Holocaust denial, people wearing fascist symbols. It's always a big thing in Germany. And now the same people who were anti-fascist now are the ones who say, okay, Hamas, they overreacted, but, well, it's provocative to dance near the Gaza Strip. How can anti-Semitism and anti-fascism go hand in hand by the same people at the same time?
Okay, I'm going to come back to the panel, and then we'll come back out. So who wants to go first?
Can I?
Yes, go on, Charlie, you're first.
I think the first question is a really important one, and it's important to defend the duty of journalists to cover evil. I mean, who is stoking up tension in this situation? Okay, is it the Islamist who records a speech that goes out to hundreds of thousands praising Hamas and criticizing those who don't support them? Or is it the journalist who covers that and draws that to the attention of the authorities? I would suggest that the Islamist is the person stoking up tension, and it is the duty of journalists to cover it and make sure that the authorities, who I think everyone in here can agree have failed so far to deal with this problem, act, because without drawing attention to it, it just continues. I think this whole phrase of sunlight is the best disinfectant is kind of overused, but it's not. Actually, action is the best disinfectant when it comes to the terrorism act. That needs to be done. And I will also say it's not a Islamophobic thing to cover this. My first job in journalism, 3 years at a Middle Eastern paper. I was based in the region quite a lot. And in my first paper, we had a theme called Preachers of Hate. This was a Arab-led, Arab-run newsroom, which covered Islamist speakers because it was their duty as Arabs, as Muslims, to defeat that evil within their community. And they are glad I'm doing this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to go next, Daniel, while we're moving in that direction?
I can do. I need about an hour if I'm going to answer all the questions I want to answer.
Yeah, well, you can try and be concise as an example to the audience.
Okay. Well, maybe just take 2 points. First, because Inai directly addressed the question to me, and I would like to discuss this in more detail. But I was quite convinced by Rakib Ehsan's research on this. He spoke as an expert on Islam and statistics. He spoke at this conference, but not in this room. And what his research suggested, although, we can maybe he's wrong, we can discuss it, but his research suggested that if you look at the Muslim community in Britain, on average, the level of anti-Semitism is higher than the general public, but it's still a minority of Muslims who are, according to his research anyway, anti-Semitic. And the second part of his research, which seems to contradict what you're saying, but maybe he's wrong, I don't know, we should discuss it. But his research seems to suggest that the more integrated Muslim communities are, and obviously when you're talking about Muslims, you're talking about Sunnis, Shiites, Sufis, people from Cyprus and Pakistan, and a very, very diverse community by many measures. From what I understand of his research, it suggests that those Muslims who are least integrated into British society are most prone to anti-Semitism. So maybe you disagree with that, but that's the finding of his research. So if someone only mixes with Muslims, only has Muslim friends and family, and doesn't mix with other people in wider British society, then they're more likely to be anti-Semitic than the people who are more integrated. But yeah, as I said, we can discuss that. Although there is, JG won't give me time to talk about this, but there are lots of symmetries between identity politics and Islamism. People assume they're very, very different, but in fact, in many, many ways, there's a lot of overlap between them. Frank alluded to some of these points. Maybe just finally, on Holocaust education, because I don't know the answer to Guy's specific question, but I think Holocaust education has done a tremendous amount of damage and has made this problem much, much worse. So, for example, I was watching a kind of big-name TV program, big money behind it, talking about Anne Frank's diaries, obviously one of the key things that is used for Holocaust education in schools. And I was just cringing watching it because you had teachers saying, well, we use Anne Frank's diaries to teach people in our anti-bullying campaigns in schools. And what they're essentially doing is they're just completely de-Judaizing the Holocaust. They're just saying it's about people being horrible, kids being horrible to each other, people behaving in a nasty way, which obviously is a complete travesty of the Holocaust. It kind of completely trivializes the Holocaust and what it's about. But that's what's been on the national curriculum, from what I can gather, in Britain for many, many years. So Holocaust education, it sounds very worthy and fantastic, but I would say it's a very big part of the problem.
Okay, Frank?
Right. There is a paradox, the German paradox, which is all these really good anti-fascist people are really anti-Semitic at the same time. So why is that? I think that there's a German reason for that and a wider reason. The German reason is that German guilt about the Holocaust is still fairly palpable, right? You can't really pretend it didn't happen, and you are obviously seen by the whole world as perpetrating a very unique and horrible act of violence upon a people. And therefore, there's always a tendency to find some way of displacing that kind of sense of guilt. And one of the ways that this is done in the German context is by saying that, oh, okay, the Jewish people are good when they're dead, when they died in the Holocaust. We have no problem with the 6 million people. But the Jews of today are very different, especially the Israelis, because they're just like the Nazis, right? They are settlers, they're oppressors. They did the most horrific thing ever imaginable, which is why they use the word genocide. I mean, it's interesting. Have you noticed how the word genocide is used casually in a way that is just totally dishonest? So by casting Jews into the role of people who do these terrible things, you actually end up saying, well, actually, us Germans, what we did in the 1940s is normal, is not particularly unique, because now the supposed victims are doing pretty much the same kind of thing. And I think that's what you have in the German context, which is why it is so important in the current narrative to be able to promote Israelis as this unique settler society, that Jews somehow have got no connection whatsoever with the whole area that is now kind of Israel. And it basically then allows for the same people to literally use the same language that the Nazis used. So I don't know if you've seen these posters that people walk around with a Star of David, and next to it says, "Let's clean the world," right? Which is not exactly a million miles away from the German word of cleansing the world of this vermin, which is meant to be Jews. I do believe in free speech, even when it's allowing people to say the most horrific things, as many of the people do on these demonstrations. I don't think we can, when I see a poster that says, let's clean the world, my whole body reacts viscerally. I feel like actually punching that person in the face. I got no, and possibly I might even do something like that I might regret later on. But at the same time, we do need to be in a situation where free speech is allowed. Because the minute we free speech, which obviously stops at inciting violence and, basically, sort of stops at kind of promoting violent behavior. Well, within that, I think we have to understand that we need to have these discussions out. Because one of the problems with Holocaust education was the fact that you couldn't deny the Holocaust. A lot of people wanted to deny the Holocaust, but you told them that's a crime. Again, in Germany, it's a crime. And of course, when you criminalize people who want to deny the existence of the Holocaust, all that it does, it drives underground, sort of those kinds of sentiments, instead of bringing it out and allowing us to engage with that and debate it. So I do think that we have to be committed to our free speech principles, even when the most horrific narratives are being hurled at us, and even when the people that are hurling those horrible narratives are driven by an ideology that's entirely evil in all of its dimensions.
Okay, Josh?
Yeah, so talking about Anne Frank Museum, I don't know if anyone's, it was about a year ago or so, but it turned out a bunch of people who worked for the Anne Frank Museum were massive anti-Semites. And that is somewhat indicative of what we've been talking about here, about certainly what I would classify as far left, but Frank has hone down further to identity politics, I think it's slightly widened that, but that's definitely a very valuable starting point. And certainly the people who follow that are travelers of these other movements. Now, coming here today, you guys probably been here most of the day. I was walking from the tube. It was when the march was finishing. And it's a mixture of young students and sort of old lefties and a lot of, I'm assuming, don't want to be racist, but I'm assuming people of Pakistani Muslim descent. And what they all shared was that they thought that they were good people. You know, and this is obviously something we all know. Everybody here thinks that we're good people. No one thinks they're immoral. They think they're out there doing what they think is right. When you were talking about anti-Semitism being on the left and, of course, the right and the world generally not liking Jews, that's true. But the thing is, when the right does it, they get shut down by the silent majority who tends to follow the left on these issues, whatever. That's what I mean by the far left, how insidious they become, because the far left obviously becoming the left means that they're the default moral position now. And so everything that they go, whether it's identity politics, is what seems to be then spread out through the various institutions of our society. But when I said that the fog cleared and everybody saw, it's like, yes, of course, there are people out there who see what they want to see, and there are immoral people and young people, and this violence means nothing to some people. But I still have faith in the silent majority of this country. I truly believe there is a silent majority, a moral silent majority out there who, when enough people speak out, and we saw it happen with the trans movement, when everybody was scared and no one wanted to just call things as they were and saw what was happening, saw people being cancelled, everybody was quiet about it. But it took just a few things, an article here in The Observer, an article, suddenly the emboldenment of it, women speaking out, other people adding to those voices. And now we see that movement in decline because the silent majority understood these very seemingly complex issues and went, wait a minute, no, right is right, wrong is wrong. A male rapist in a female prison is wrong. That's it, okay? And I believe that over here, it's not fully rescinded across in America and whatnot, but that is what is happening. And their silent majority are standing up. And it comes down to exactly what you were saying, Frank. It's about bravery. It's about bravery. It's about not kowtowing for fear of appearing to be racist. It's calling things as they are. A decapitated baby is evil. A mutilated, raped child is evil. And the people who lend their voices and cover that in their obscure terminology are wrong, and they need to be challenged. And that is the first step.
Okay, so I'm going to come out to the audience, and I want to encourage people, if you have any problems with what the speakers are saying, if you've got friends who have, I'm sure you've got friends who have been joining these protests and they say things that you find difficult to answer because, you know, it can be difficult to answer, then feel free to ask those questions as well. Okay, so I'm going to take the lady in the front, and then I'm going to take the two women, not that you're not ladies, further back in the room.
Thank you. This is really about the Muslim population in the United Kingdom. We've got I think about 3.5 million Muslims in this country, of which you mentioned the majority are not anti-Semitic. However, one of the problems I have with that idea is, where are they? Why weren't they walking in the street saying, "Not in my name," when a group of people who claim to be doing this in the name of Islam were conducting a pogrom?
Okay, I'm going to take the two women at the back. I can't see them. I can just see their hands, and from that I can see the women.
Yeah, if you come from the left, like I come from, you kind of make an association with you want to fight for the Palestinians. The left has always been associated with the struggle for the Palestinian cause. And so what I found really interesting, I heard Frank Furedi in an interview he gave to Spike very recently. He tried to explain how there's always been anti-Zionism on the left, but somehow, because of some cultural trends in the West, now it's also taking an anti-Jewish form. And so what I want to ask, if you could maybe explain that more. And then the other question is that I was listening to Melanie Felix on an interview, and she tried to explain why is it that the West, she says that the reason why the conflict between Israel and Palestine is so protracted, that doesn't seem to be any solution. She argues that it is because the Western institutions like the UN, the EU, most of the establishment on the left take the sides of the Palestinians. So what do you think about this analysis?
Okay, I'm going to take the other, that's right, the woman next to her, and then I'm going to take these two men at the front before their arms drop off.
I mean, I may just be paranoid, but the image of Jews in the imagination of so many people in our societies really seems to me to conform to the portrayal of Jews in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the way that Israel responded to the massacre on the 7th of October, it really fits into that narrative as well. I had friends telling me, well, you know, Netanyahu, he must have known, he would have known, but for his ulterior motives, he didn't stop it so that then he can take over Gaza and then the Third World War. In other words, you know, it's the same kind of really narrative. And in fact, I was thinking about it, and I think the whole history of Israel, from Herzl's Zionist project, its relationship with imperialism, then the creation of the state, in a way, you can all see it through that similar narrative, and they fit so kind of entrenched in society and the way people are thinking. It has such plausibility. How on earth do we fight it?
Okay, I'm going to take Simon and then the man there in the very nice suit.
Thank you. Frank, I think I would add a fourth thing that I've learned since the 7th of October, and that is that EDI and HR departments aren't interested in fighting racism. These are the same departments that when George Floyd was murdered by the police, couldn't wait to announce how anti-racist they were. And yet when anti-Semitic attacks are up by over 1,000% here in the UK, they are completely silent. And I'd like to know from the panel, how do you account for this silence?
Okay, I'm going to take one more person and then, oh yeah, sorry, there you are. The man in the
nice suit, remember? Yeah. I stand up.
Yeah, stand up so we can all...
You really want to see the suit, right? It is nice. Yeah, a 12 for those at the back. Okay, so I wanted to know how the panel think we should talk about history and the question of Gaza, because I spent a lot of time over the last 2 weeks arguing with people about the history of this conflict, the Gaza and Israeli conflict. And I remember arguing with people about it at university. And of course, at one level, you think, what am I doing? Arguing about history at a time like this. This is a question about the present moment. But of course, I've done a lot of reading around, done a deep dive into the texts that people tend to read at university, things like The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine and books in that tradition. And they take this as the great victim story of the 20th century, that the founding of Israel was one of the great historic crimes against the Palestinian people, that it has never been legitimate, that it is its very existence is an affront to ideas of national determination and things like that. And you can't help be drawn into debates around this topic, because so many of the middle-class, well-meaning people that are on that demonstration are steeped in this story of relentless victimization of Gaza and of the Palestinians. And I completely appreciate that is a confusion that we need to tackle and address. And I think it's that, but understanding that is understanding how well-meaning middle-class people on this demonstration can go from saying, well, I think what happened to the Palestinians in 1948 was wrong, to then arguing from the valley to the sea, Palestine will be free, arguing that they should dismantle a modern democracy full of 10 million people and effectively throw them back into diaspora. And I think that's one of the most common middle-class anti-Semitic opinions that now permeates. And I think one of the urgent questions we have is how that becomes such an easy position for so many people to hold.
Does anybody want to have a stab at answering any of the questions that have been thrown up? Okay, I'll take the lady in the hat, and then I'm going to take the lady. I'm going to take the lady there, next to the woman in the red jumper.
I think that the question about, the middle class people accept that Palestinians are the victims, I think it's partly because most people don't read deep enough into what's actually happened in Gaza all these years. For a start, when the Israelis left Gaza, they left all the hydroponic greenhouses and so on, a thriving business, if you like, so they could have sold fruit and veg. An American gave $50 million so that they would have this lovely, cash flow so they could be a great success. And of course, the Europeans would have bought all the fruit and veg. Within about 3 days, they smashed them all to bits because they were touched by Jew hands. So they didn't want that. And when the Abraham Accords came into being, the people in Gaza were marching and stamping on photographs of the leader of UAE and the other leaders because they had betrayed the Palestinians. And a Saudi prince spoke out, and you can find the stuff online. He spoke out, I think, in Al Arabiya or one of those programs, and he said, "This is ridiculous. We have given billions to Gaza. Where has the money gone?" And at the same time, Reuters, for a change, and AP started putting up pictures of these properties, beautiful gardens and what have you, properties that were built by the UAE leaders. They'd actually paid for all that to be built. And during COVID, they opened up another brand new shopping center, the third massive shopping mall for the very middle class Gazan people. The point is that the BBC will only ever show you an old gentleman with about 3 teeth sitting on a plastic chair with the house that was bombed 2 years ago. They only ever show those shots. They won't show you the other bit. But the Saudi man, the Saudi prince, was very clear because he was furious. They were stamping on the pictures of their leaders and saying, "We gave you all this money, and we all know the Arab countries have given them billions. So has the West, the US, the UK, the EU, the UN. And where's that money gone?" You cannot get people marching on a Friday afternoon, burning tires, throwing missiles into Israel if they're not starving. And that's why you keep people poor, because you need that cannon fodder.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the lady here next to the lady in the red jumper.
So I think that I wanted to take up the last point that Frank was talking about in terms of what's really new about modern anti-Semitism, because I think one of the things I was most shocked about was how quickly young people in America immediately sided with, against Jews. I thought it was like almost instantaneous. And I think, there's a lot that you could talk about in terms of the history of Palestine, the history of Gaza, and going into the history books. But young kids, my children, my children's generation, they were the kids who were out on demonstrations in Washington Square, condemning and holding up those anti-Semitic signs. And I think that there is something new about what is going on now. And I thought your points about the fact that it's about white supremacy and an anti-Western outlook, I think is where we've lost that generation. And it isn't Muslims, it's not about Hamas, it's our kids. I mean, they all think that, they talk about colonialism. I mean, my daughter's never even thought about colonialism before, but suddenly this has become the great evil. And I think that is something that I'm really quite frightened by, because it feels like a whole generation of young people have given up on civilization?
Okay, I'm going to take the panel and then I'm going to come back out to the audience. So please be thinking of things to say, but also listening to the panel. Do you want to go first, Josh?
Yeah, I'll go first. Chief Rabbi Sachs, who was the former chief rabbi of this country, great man. Lots of people will quote this, but it's very famous. But he basically said that anti-Semitism has morphed through the eras. So in the Middle Ages, it was about religion. In the sort of 19th, 20th century, under Nazism and whatnot, it became about race. And now it's morphed into Israel. When you say it's a new thing, I think it's not that it's new. The anti-Israel sentiment's been out there for a long time. Also, this anti-colonialism, I think we're just reaching a flashpoint of it. And tying in all the different questions feels to me very much is about narrative. Because in terms of we're asking like why people are inclined to believe conspiracy theories is because it comes down to that very anti-Semitism. So that is, I don't see how we can deal with it apart from be as loud as possible to call attention to it, as people now have their eye on this stuff. But it's always been there, and I feel in some ways this is an opportunity to really shine it in the, as we were talking about, get it, not just shine what's going on in with parts of Islam, but also to shine all the identity politics.
Yeah. So when people say that only a minority are anti-Semitic, I think that doesn't mean very much. And the reason why that doesn't really very much is because when you have the majority keeping stumt, and when the majority isn't really opening their mouth, then they might as well join the club and join the anti-Semites, because what they're doing is they're acquiescing to a horrible scenario, which they themselves might not actively participate, but they passively acquiesce. And that's what been always the problem. It's a bit like saying that in Weimar Germany, the majority of Germans were good Germans and they weren't anti-Semitic. And probably, they didn't go around with brown shirts, but when the brown shirts came out, they kept stumt and didn't really open their mouths. So we got to be very, very careful here, because what we have is a really big problem. It's a really big problem for the very simple reason that certain dimensions of the debate have never been confronted. So people are scared, even Jewish people are scared to actually argue for the legitimate right of Israel to be a state. I mean, they just avoid the question instead of confronting the issue, what happened in 1948, and basically asking the question, are you saying, when you talk about Israel as being a secular society, are you really saying that somehow Jews have got no connection to this part of the world, that somehow they've been parachuted in, and that all the links and the organic connections that go back to the past are just made up? Is that what you're saying? So are you saying that somehow they have less of a right to be there than anybody else, when before 1948 there wasn't a state, there was a colony, and that was about all? People are really not prepared to confront these hard, difficult, particular questions. And things have changed. Right, and I know myself as an individual, I used to be anti-Zionist because in my eyes, I wanted to see a two-state solution, a solution where you had, Jews and Palestinians, living together in the same kind of society. After a while, when I began to realize what was going around me, I defined myself as an anti-Zionist, because I thought that anti-Zionists were worse than anybody else, whereas now, I unconditionally support Israel to do whatever it wants, because that's the only way that it can survive in the present kind of context. So things have changed. And I think it's important that we're alive to the novelty of the situation and not just simply see it as being more of the same. It's happened in our lifetime, happened in my lifetime, all these incredibly, sort of important shifts. And it seems to me that we have to understand that we have a problem here that requires us to go back to first principles, to explain the right of Israel to exist, to insist on that as being really critically important, to take up the anti-colonial, decolonization rhetoric and expose that for being, in a sense, both dishonest, however well meant it is, it's both dishonest and also sort of quite quite tendential. And finally, to really confront people about the fact that what you're really saying in the way you're reacting in terms of your double standard is you really are anti-Semitic. You don't like Jewish people, and you think that the world will be better without them. And that's really what you're saying in the kind of rhetoric that you're putting forward, instead of being defensive about it. And we have to be, I cannot really emphasize, it was really brought home to me last week. I organized a meeting in Brussels on Israel, and it was the only meeting in Israel that was defending Israelis and Jews in the whole bloody Brussels. That's a sign of the times. In the middle of the meeting, this Jewish rabbi, a typical caricature of a Jewish rabbi with a big beard in the head, stands up, and he asked a very simple question. He basically says, listen, guys, what would you do? What would you do if you saw me on the metro in Brussels and somebody spat at me? What would your reaction be? And I looked around the room, and you could tell that even in that room, a lot of people would have looked the other way. Right? A lot of people, even in that room, would have looked at their shoelaces instead of doing the right thing. Right? And I think that when a guy posed that question, it really hit me emotionally, because I realized that what he's really saying in his old quasi-religious, mystical way, what he was really getting at is actually a call to arms. Call to arms, not necessarily with rifles and stuff like that, but a call to arms that the time has come to be counted. The time has really come to be counted and to speak out loud. Even when you see demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people, the time has come to really go on record and state what has to be said.
Okay, hold your clapping. We're not finished yet.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on your question. Why was there no marching on October the 7th after it didn't take long, actually, for good verified information of what happened on the 7th, and they wanted to come to the West, actually, 4 hours. I think you had a good understanding that a massacre had happened. Why were there no marches that day? Why did it take 2 days for the first Israeli flag to be put up on a British national institution? It's put up in Downing Street, the only building behind armed guards. It wasn't up on the National Gallery, for example, or on the London Eye. I think that was very interesting. Well, why did that? I think, because there is no shame in silence on that kind of violence. And if you cast your mind back, just 3 years ago after the death of George Floyd, and taking my Instagram stories as a barometer, most people were of the view that silence is violence on that issue. You have to speak out against deep-set oppressor situations that lead to that kind of disaster and death. But that same kind of call to action and to speak out was not present for the 7th, for Black Saturday, as it's being referred to in Israel. And because, why is that happening? Well, because I think actually we don't know the social attitudes on violence against Israel within all communities. We don't know what the view is, but it's clear that there isn't a ginormous social cost to being silent on it. Okay? We know that at least. And there probably is a big one for saying that this is what's going on. And it goes back to what Josh was saying, I think, in his first bit about how the first reaction was the fog machine of covering it up. And a lot of our work in Israel was actually responding to people back home who were uncritically reporting, almost as stenographers, Hamas press releases, but were with, the most aggressive fine comb, every single claim out of Israeli sides. Even independent forensic pathologists dealing with infants without heads were told, but that beheading could have happened after death. That was a common response to some of the horrors that we all saw, actually, and all journalists there saw that independently, not just through information released by the IDF. And there was more, I think, of an effort within some communities in Britain to refer to a conspiracy about what happened there rather than to condemn it. And it goes to what I don't know, I think I can see it, but a woman further back said that there was this theory of, they must have known about the attack. It was some great theory, a great plan to finally ethnically cleanse and commit a genocide on Gaza. I think that's connected to this view that Israel is deserving of the violence it receives. And so, yes, victim blaming has been a consistent theme of the coverage and discussion since the 7th.
Daniel.
Yeah, I don't know if people remember, but at the very beginning of my introduction, I said that my original speech that I planned was going to be against this idea of anti-Semitism as the oldest hatred, which I think Josh seemed to endorse. So the idea that, of course, it's changed its spots, but it's basically the same phenomenon that you've always had. And I haven't got time to go into detail in that, but I very much agree with the way Frank posed it, that you can't really see it like that because of the new broader developments in society, like, for example, the rise of identity politics, which are not directly to do with Jews. You know, there are other broader forces that have driven the rise of identity politics. But for various reasons, I mean, Jews do have a great knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, that Jews become the victims, the most direct victims of it. So you have to understand specifically the dynamics of what's happening now, rather than just seeing it as the leopard changing its spots, which I think is not very helpful. I think the question on why most Muslims don't stand up against this is an interesting question, which gives me a flashback to a year ago. We had a meeting in this room on anti-Semitism, and the room was about half full, and there was no one queuing outside. And we did have someone from an organisation called Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, which does still exist, but as far as I can tell, it's actually a very small organisation. But there are a few Muslims who are willing to stand up against anti-Semitism. But I think, why don't more Muslims do it? I mean, I think one reason is that they have really, they're very viciously treated by the kind of Islamists within the Muslim community. You know, the Islamists hate Jews, but they hate the kind of people they see as non-authentic Muslims and apostates even more. But I think more important than that, it's just part of the broader trend in society. You can't, in that respect, you can't single out Muslims. If there's a broader trend where most people are acquiescent to the rise of anti-Semitism, then it's not that surprising that a lot of Muslims are also acquiescent to it. And I would hope that if there is a movement, a political movement to challenge anti-Semitism, then more Muslims also, along with the general population, would be more willing to stand up against it. And finally, the question asked by the guy in the nice suit over there, I think what you described, we should remember, is a kind of contemporary take on Israel and anti-Semitism, you know, this whole victim thing. Because if you go back 30 or 40 years, a lot of people on the left did admire Israel, and they saw it as an example of national not because from a victim perspective, but they saw it as an example of national self-determination. Whereas now the idea of national self-determination has gone out of fashion. So obviously, from that perspective, you wouldn't laud Israel for that. I think in 1967, Isaac Deutscher basically talked about the twin tragedy of the Jews fleeing mainly from Europe, although also later on the Arab world. So a real tragedy, huge tragedy of anti-Semitism in the mid-20th century, and Jews fleeing to what was British Mandate Palestine. Obviously, you'd be completely insane to blame the Palestinians for that, although they did suffer the consequences for it. So, you know, it's not like, in that sense, you have a kind of good, one side really good and one side really bad. You had a kind of terrible coincidence of circumstances of Jews fleeing, usually because they had no other choice, and the Palestinians suffering as a result. But now the situation has changed again, because I think with the rise of Islamism as a political movement, so, you know, Hamas, we can talk more about that. Hamas is not a national liberation movement. It's a completely, thoroughly reactionary, genocidal, well, I don't use the word genocidal loosely, genocidal kind of movement. Now you have that also, I think, changes the equation. And the context has changed very much, so we really need to kind of get to grips with the concepts and the history better than we have done until now.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to come out to the audience for another round of questions, and then we'll come back to the panel. So I can see the man there who puts his hand up very discreetly. There you go. No, not that man, the discreet man. and then we'll take my friend Molly, who's standing by the pillar.
I really take the point about looking that this is a turning point. I mean, Middle Eastern politics have often had an impact in the West, you know, and there've been protests. But my strong recollection is, say, in 2003, when the Iraq war was going on, my Somali neighbor got her windows broken, and that was the kind of the mob reaction. Whereas in these recent events, it's people attacking Jews and going around Hendon honking the horn. And I think this is such, you can't understate this, how important it is that the left-wing attitude that would have restrained, I mean, there are a lot of anti-Semites on the left, but, there would have been some inkling that there's something wrong with Jews being rounded up and killed. That would have been a strong sentiment in a liberal society for a long time, and it was important. But that doesn't exist, or if it is, it's held by elderly people who are dismissed and ridiculed by their children and their grandchildren, to the point where it's like, well, that's a passé point of view, and that's the real kind of disaster that we're in, is that it's the context, and that's why, if Muslims have bad attitudes on Israel, I'm thinking, well, that's a problem in Pakistan or wherever. I think the real problem is here. That here is, if some Muslim student in my class has got a reactionary view that he kind of doesn't want to say, I feel good about that. But if he feels like he can let rip, and all the rest, all the Dutch students and all the English students and they're all going, yeah, right on, brother, that is really bad. And then I think, this is where we have to start taking a stand on this.
Okay, now we'll take Mark. Back there. Sorry, and then I'm going to take the man standing next to this pillar who had his hand up for a long time, and then the woman next to him.
Thank you. So in Arendt's amazing work on totalitarianism, she talks about anti-Semitism and says how it's often a proxy or a cipher for something else. And I think in this situation, we can really see that. So, of course, it's important to understand the history, Palestine and greenhouses and 1948 and all that kind of thing. But what we're experiencing today is that if you want to be a radical anti-nation, then who better to be against Israel? And if you want to be even more radical, anti-Semitic. Nowadays, if anti-community, anti the use of force, standing up for yourself, anti-civilization, like Frank is talking about, and the most worrying trend, I think, which Helen was talking about with the young, even just anti-establishment, just even something vague and broad like being anti-establishment now puts you in the anti-Semitic camp. So I think this idea that this is going to make it so hard for us and so important, because all of the tools that we would use to stand up to this, like courage and bravery, like people have talked about, are the tools that are under threat by the people who are promoting these ideas. They're the tools that the young think are a waste of time standing up for things. So we're going to be appealing to, it's going to be really hard. And I think the calls to arms that a number of people have made are going to be really important. I think there's some kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, some kind of middle layer here where people need to understand that they're in that middle layer. There's the universities, there's the professors, they're all playing with fire with this stuff. They're spouting all of this stuff. It's like Helen said, and like Daniel said in his introduction, it's going down to the young, and they're fairly indifferent. The Israelophobia book makes the point that people learn about Israel through osmosis, so they're taking on board all this stuff. So the middle layer, I think, is going to be crucial here of people standing up.
Okay, thanks. The man there, thank you for being patient. Sorry, I forgot you.
Cheers, thank you. I appreciate probably among a lot of free speech absolutists and also people that don't like anyone else suggesting words for them to use, but I'm probably going to do a bit of both of those things in that I wanted to pose a question to the panel. We have laws against Holocaust denial. Should we expand such laws to include eliminationism? And also, I would want to call on anyone with influence to do what they can to change the narrative, because I feel like eliminationism has been allowed to become a moderate and even default position in this discourse, and Zionism has been allowed to become some sort of unreasonable and crazy position when that strikes me as the wrong way round. Also, in terms of work being done to look into the extent of eliminationism ideology and philosophy being spouted within certain communities, I think we definitely need to do concerted work to understand that and quantify it. And I think we might be quite terrified and unsettled by what we uncover. I think it's
it's nice to tell ourselves that this is an extreme thing, but I'm afraid that I don't think it is.
Okay, can I just ask what you meant eliminationism? You mean the idea that Jews should be eliminated?
The idea that the solution to the situation is the elimination of the State of Israel.
Okay, if you could just pass the microphone to that lady there. Thank you.
Hi, just first to Daniel's point about Hamas being a genocidal organization. Why was there no, if you go over to the kind of like the merch tent over in the Palace Green, it's full of Free Palestine flags, but none of them actually say Free Palestine from Hamas, which is actually the occupier of that place. And second, the left kind of, it captures this argument, and it captures people's emotional imagination, because people aren't actually that rational. They are mostly emotional. They decide and then they rationalize their decisions. So, and the left kind of captures that ground because it has a brand that tells people, if you follow us, you are a good person. Now, we have to do something about that. This is kind of a different realm. We can't win the points via rationalism. We have to actually go a bit more deeper than that.
Yeah, can you wind up, please, because we're going to have to finish soon.
So,
that was. Thank you. I'm going to take Kevin at the back, and then I'm going to take the man on the door with the nice jumper.
Guys, forgive me if I'm discombobulated a wee bit in how I speak. I am very anti-Israel state. I think it absolutely oppresses the Palestinian people. And I'm absolutely not an anti-Semite in any shape, form or fashion. And I think there's a real danger that we're entering into a new level of culture war where people see things as absolutely black and white. And I'm not sure that's very helpful. Luke asked the question, he talked about his mates and trying to analyse the historical specificity and material conditions of Israel-Palestine. And he said, but someone else came back, someone in the panel said, no, it's all about, Islam and this and that. I absolutely empathise with the Palestinians. I think they're absolutely oppressed by the Israeli state. The Israeli state, in my opinion, sorry if I sound old-fashioned, backed up by imperialism by America, Britain and the major powers. Maybe it's because I'm Irish. Maybe it's because of the psyche of people who suffered colonization. I'm not sure. But here's my point to Frank. Frank, if that rabbi, I was on the tube platform with that rabbi and somebody spat on it, I'd headbutt the fucker who did that. I'd try to punch him in the head if I could. My point that I'm really trying to emphasize is we've got to be careful not to rush into caricatures. I've been on the Palestinian demos, a couple of them. I've marched on them. I have to be honest with you, for hours and hours, and I absolutely know that you had the Hizb to hear people, you had the people in Sydney saying gas to Jews and other things. All I can say is my personal experience in those demos, speaking to lots of people, intelligent, open-minded people who felt for the Palestinians. And my final point, how could you not feel for them about when you think about the bombing in Gaza? And of course, if I have to even say, of course, my heart goes out to the Israeli people butchered by Hamas. But when you say, Frank, finally, we should unconditionally support the state of Israel, I just can't do that. I don't want to tug at the heartstrings, but when you see the children dead and women and others being pulled out of the rubble, it's just not something I can support, and I think it needs to be called out.
Okay, we're not going to have any heckling. You've had your chance to speak. All right, I'm going to bring the panel back after this.
Kind of in response to that, I watched Matt Fry from Channel 4, whom I think are a disgraceful TV station, but Channel 4 interviewing Hanan Ashawi. You probably remember her, people would remember her. She's a long-standing PLO spokesperson. She has, 11 doctorates from different countries around the world. But Matt Fry said to her, what's going to happen when Israel gets rid of Hamas? And she laughed at his naivety and saying, do you really think they're going to get rid of Hamas? Hamas has an army, it has a military wing, it has a student movement, it has a women's movement, and it has endless funding. And it's interesting because if you look at what happened in the EU, and Frank probably knows more about it than I do, but reading about it, Ursula von der Leyen's first response was to say, stop the funding to the Palestinians. And I think it was the Hungarian commissioner who went along with that and said, yes, And then the charge came in from other EU countries, of which Ireland was the leader, to my great shame, saying that, you're acting unilaterally there. We should all have a say in what happens here. But from then on, it was like a de-emphasizing of what had happened to Israel all along the line. And, if you look at what EU funding is, 199, nearly 200 million euros to Hamas every year. And some of that money, for example, is used to make payments, stipends to people who are prisoners, Hamas prisoners in Israel, where it's derisively called in Israel pay to slay. So the idea that, EU money or EU funding or that Hamas are just this kind of parasitic group on the Palestinians, as Hannah Ashari said, they're intricately integrated completely into Palestinian life. And so that has to be borne in mind when you're thinking about what Israel has to do to get rid of these people.
Okay, thank you. Well, I've had the yellow card from the man at the back, so I'm going to bring back the panel, but I want to remind you that this is only the beginning of our discussion. There will be the online discussion on November the 2nd, and tomorrow afternoon, there is a session, Israel at War. So, who wants to go first? Oh, Charlie, thank you.
So much to take on there. We have 4.5 minutes, so I'll be very quick. On your point there about how this conflict is referred to and discussed, the both sidesism approach to it, I think, is quite strange. And we haven't had both sides when it was, say, Western military powers versus ISIS, even in the siege of Mosul, which we're going to see repeated in Gaza, that 2016 siege that took months, tens of thousands of people died. Many of them were civilians in appalling bombings that were targeted and justified under international humanitarian law. Under the law of armed conflict, they were approved. They were good strikes. They were legitimate. But there was not the same sort of, let's make sure both sides are heard here. There were civilians are suffering here, but we must destroy ISIS. We're not getting that same approach to Hamas. I think that's very interesting. And an earlier point, real problems are here. Yes, I think they are. And I think a month ago, we heard Suella Braverman give a speech at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., where she said, multiculturalism has failed. And you'll recall the aggressive response given to that as a most outrageous slur and a disgusting thing to say. Those same people are now saying, oh shit, she might have had something that I should have heard and listened to and taken on board as they watch pogroms occur in northwest London. Right, thanks.
Okay, I'm going to take Daniel now.
Okay, yeah, well, there is a session tomorrow. I'll be talking more about Israel with another panel, but I think the key thing to understand in relation to that is it is not a two-sided conflict. It is not Israel against the Palestinians. There is Israel, there is the Palestinians, and there is Hamas. And most Israelis I know, I mean, who knows, things may change in the future. Even friends of mine or family of mine who are West Bank settlers actually say they feel empathy for the Palestinians. Obviously, they hate Hamas and they don't want violence against Israel. But even they volunteer the fact they do feel sad for what's happening for the Palestinians. They do have empathy for the Palestinians. But it's not Israel against the Palestinians. There is Hamas, which clearly is genocidal against Israel, but is also against national self-determination for the Palestinians. It's not an organization for Palestinian freedom. What their conception is, they want to destroy Israel and create a kind of Islamized Palestine as a step towards their goal of an international Islamic order. So they're completely against national self-determination, not just for Israel, as it happens, but for the Palestinians too.
Okay, I'm going to take Josh now.
I thought it was quite brave of the man at the back to say that in this room. Fundamentally disagree with you. It goes to what we were saying about free speech. I think that it's good that you said that. I feel like it exposes certain things. You being on those marches, you might not see it, but I'm telling you what, Jews see it. Jews see the posters. Jews see the call for jihad. It's nice that you're seeing the 90% of nice people who just want everyone to get along. That's not the reality of where we are at the moment. And, as I'm going to guess that you'll consider yourself left-wing, but, that's great. You see this guy be a rabbi and you would stand up for him. I wonder if you would confront people for tearing down posters of children or not. 100%. You would. Okay, well, you know what? Good for you. I feel like within what you said about was somewhat revealing in terms of the pictures of the babies. Well, there are pictures of babies, of course, on both sides. What the narrative seems to be for you, though, is like that one set of babies is more important. Everybody wants peace. That the question is, how is that going to be? How's Israel going to make that happen? Well, of course, they have to get rid of Hamas. That's just the reality on the ground. No one wants more dead babies of any denomination. But I think part of that within this country, within this room, is about standing up, bravery. And, someone said online, sort of like, oh, you sound like a Zionist. And my reply was, yeah, you're damn fucking right, I'm a Zionist. And that is where it has to be. That's where the fight back starts at this level, as you were talking about the middle ground, the silent majority.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Frank.
I don't think we should be arguing kind of Hamas is really bad people and Jews are really good people. The point is, Israelis are not angels, right? I mean, Jews are not angels. We're just like anybody else in the world. There's nothing particularly different about them. But the point is that the crux of the matter is, does Israel have a right to exist? And the crux of the matter to me is this. After those horrific pogroms have been done, and they were done in the most vivid, multicolored, sort of social media kind of a way, I draw the conclusion that under those circumstances, if you are an Israeli, and if you got brain cells, you would argue that the only way that you can survive is if you basically go all out and destroy Hamas, right? And the only way you can destroy Hamas is by unleashing fairly significant firepower, as they're doing at the moment in Gaza. Maybe they should be doing a little bit more. I don't know. I'm not a military expert. But the point that I would make at the end of the day is that we are living in a different context, in a different situation. The battles are really different. I'm not surprised that it was the Irish in the EU that were the first ones that wanted to give money to Hamas, because if you look at who are the most pro-Hamas, most pro-Palestinian people at the moment, they're the people that believe in same-sex marriage. They're the people that believe in transgender ideology. They're the same people that believe in taking the knee. They're the people that sign up to every single war cause imaginable. And Palestine is just another one. Ireland happens to be the most wokish country within the European Union. So therefore, it's not particularly surprising that they kind of responded in this way. And that tells me one thing which is very important. I don't worry about Islamism. That's not a problem that I'm really concerned. I'm concerned about the woke identitarian influence upon Western society. There's something that confronts us in every single way. There's something that we can fight in the here and now, by using our arguments, by standing up to what they're saying. They are the pernicious influence at the moment that's creating in this country and in European societies all the negative and bad things that occurred. Did you hear Michelle Hussein on BBC today interviewing an Israeli official? And Michelle Hussein, the first question she asked is, how many babies did you kill today, right? Now, that to me, that question, by the BBC really captures the double standard that has occurred. I don't hear Michelle Hussein asking Hamas how many babies or how many women have you raped today, or how many women's bodies you humiliated. And that's the kind of problem that we're confronted with. Michelle Hussein works for a publicly owned organization, the mainstream of British society, the BBC. And if the BBC adopts this particular approach, then we've got a mighty big job on our hand.